Welcome to Living from the Soul. This is your host, Sam Tarode, and today I'm excited to be speaking with Karen Newell. Karen is the co-author, with her partner Eben Alexander, of the book Living in a Mindful Universe. She's also the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, a company that creates sound journeys for meditation. I've been using these tracks myself lately and enjoying them quite a bit. You can learn more and download a free track at sacredacoustics.com. I wanted to talk with Karen about meditation, sound technology, and also her lifelong interest in esoteric wisdom. I hope you'll enjoy our conversation.
Hello.
Hey, Karen, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Great. Thanks so much for taking time to talk with me.
Sure. It's my pleasure.
I've got your book here, Living in a Mindful Universe. I read it for the second time over the past week and really enjoyed it. Definitely one of my favorite books.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's written with your partner, Eben Alexander.
Yes. And it's written in his voice, but both of us wrote the book. Yes.
Yeah, and he has one of the most well-known near-death experiences ever. He was a neurosurgeon, a materialist who then had this experience that changed his worldview. I was curious what your co-writing process is. I know times I've written with other people, that can be one of the hardest things when two people have a certain way they want to word something.
It is really hard. The way we work together is that Eben is much more the scientist, and I'm much more the consciousness explorer. I already had gained my own experience with exploring consciousness and such, and this was all new to him, but he's very scientific. So when he would write all of his science, I would go through and make sure that it was understandable by a layperson.
Yeah.
Because he's very academic and can get all up in his head. And so that was how I would make it so it was readable to a layperson, but then he would have to go back and review to make sure I hadn't dumbed it down too much. And likewise, he would assist me with what is it that we even need to say, and whatever I would write, he would then go back and edit. So we would edit each other's work, and then it smoothed out into a nice format as you have found.
Yeah, it's definitely very readable and approachable. And you still had a relationship after finishing the book, so apparently the process wasn't too painful.
You know, that's really funny because I am quite the taskmaster and project manager. I want to set a schedule. I want to get certain things done by this time, and then by the next day have this done. And Eben doesn't work quite that way. But yeah, we would set up a little reward system. If he met a goal, then we could have a certain activity. It was just really great fun, really.
Nice.
Yeah, but yep, still together.
I was curious, and the book answers this a little. I was curious at what point you two met after his near-death experience.
Well, Eben had his near-death experience in November of 2008, and we met in November of 2011. And recall at this time, his book wasn't published yet. He had written his story down, but he hadn't really met an agent. The week after we met is when he met an agent. Someone had referred to him, and then it was about 2 months later that he got a book contract. But when we met was before all of that public story was out. And so I knew he had had a near-death experience. I'd known others who had near-death experiences, and I knew that they usually learned some very personal spiritual lesson, you know, how to treat people better or how to change themselves and such. And so I was curious, and I asked him, what was the big lesson you learned during your near-death experience? And he says to me, the brain doesn't create consciousness. And I was confused, and I said, well, why would anyone think that it does? Because I had already kind of realized that there was much more to our world than just the physical that we see around us. And that was just a fresh new concept for him, coming from that medical materialist background. And so this immediately told us we were at these two ends of the spectrum, and we just had so much common ground when we started talking about it, mostly because I had so much information about all the things he was very curious about. So that's where it really came in handy. And I will mention that there's a lot of people who write about quantum physics and try to share that with lay people and other scientific concepts. And Eben will often say that those kind of more popular writers aren't necessarily sticking to the true science as a materialist scientist would understand it. And so he brings this very conscious background to it. He doesn't want to be squirrely or loose on any of the connections he's making scientifically. And so while I open him up to new horizons, he keeps me kind of, nope, we got to stick with the science. So it's a really great partnership.
That is great. And definitely important to keep to the science. I did read last summer the book, The Dancing Wu-Li Masters by Gary Zukav.
Yes, that was really, I will say, that was one of, if not the first, sort of books written for the lay people. And he was hanging out with a bunch of quantum physicists in California, Northern California, who were really exploring the implications of what the quantum physics experiments showed. And that was that our mind, the observer that is within all of us, actually plays a role in how our reality unfolds. And so that's what Gary Zukav was trying to bring to the world through Dancing Wu-Li Masters. But I will tell you, that was a challenging book to understand. I don't know how you did with that one.
I did all right. There were definitely some parts over my head. But he had a number of physicists read his book and make sure that everything was correct. So,
yes, he was very strict about that. In fact, we've met Gary, and we have great fun talking about all of this with him. And of course, so much has happened since Dancing Wu-Li Masters came out. Many, many more, even traditional physicists, are getting on board with this idea, although it's taking really a slow time to make it to the masses. But that day is coming.
Yeah, it is amazing how long it takes scientific revolutions to sink in to the public.
Yeah, some say that you have to sort of the older ones who are stuck in their ways need to die off, right, before we can bring new concepts to life. But I think it's going to happen. It's happening. I think that people in the world are starting to realize this, and it's the scientists who need to catch up with their documentation and validation. So we're getting there.
One thing that caught my attention on your biography, on the back of the book, it says, "You're a lifelong seeker of esoteric wisdom." So I thought, well, I want to talk to you and hear more about that. I wondered, to begin, what was it in your childhood that began to draw you in this direction?
What was in my childhood was a distinct lack of answers to questions that I had. Nobody could answer things like, why are we here? What is our purpose? I was raised in a Christian household, as many Americans are, and a Protestant household. But my grandmother was very much an evangelical Christian, and she was very dogmatic in her understanding of how it all worked. And so she sat me down when I was about 6, 7 years old. And she told me that I needed to believe in Jesus so that I could go to heaven and not hell if I happened to die. And I said, well, why would just believing in Jesus determine where I went? And she said, well, that's just how it works. And I said, so what about all the other kids out there who don't hear about this? Are they just going to go to hell for all of eternity and just burn? And she said, well, yes, but that's why we have missionaries. And right at that moment, I just rejected it. I said, no, Grandma, that can't be true. I more said that inside than directly to her. But inside, I just didn't believe any of that would be the basis of really the answer to why we are here. And so I continued to go to my Methodist church, and in the inside, I wasn't necessarily on board with all of the dogma, but I very much enjoyed the fellowship and, hanging out with the other young kids who were interested in just having fun, really. That was my religious upbringing. And so in secular school, there were also no answers. Nobody could tell us. And when you went to physics class, they would just tell you how a ball rolled down the hill. And I'm like, why are we here? Yeah. What is our purpose? And so those answers weren't there. And so as I was growing up, I also was very cognizant that our ancient history was not complete. This was a driving sort of noticing that I had as a child, especially when we learned about the Great Pyramids in Giza. They teach you that the oldest pyramid is actually built with the greatest technological advances. And they say that even now, I learned this as a child in the 70s, but even now, 50 years later, we can't explain. We can't even use our existing modern technology to meet the engineering feat of that Great Pyramid. And it's all about how it's a perfect square, the way it's aligned in the perfect north, south, east, west, just all kinds of things make it very unique. And so I knew deep inside that we had lost knowledge. And so I thought the answer to that lost knowledge would also give me the answers to why are we here? What is our purpose? So that is why I started reading anything I could get my hands on that wasn't conventional, but that could be somewhat trusted. And that's tricky. It was challenging to find the sources that I could really count on. But things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, those Nag Hammadi, where they found all of those documents that never made it into the Bible, those were of great interest to me. Theosophical writings were of great interest. I had my hand at Eastern writings, the Vedic texts, many other things. I had a much easier time understanding Western esoterica than I understood Eastern esoterica. And that's because I have a Western mind. And the Eastern ways of explaining things were always so mysterious. Yeah. But the Western ways, while the esoteric can come across as mysterious, it is easier to wrap your head around because the Western mind is very used to sort of a cause and effect, linear progression, and the way we put things together with reason and logic, whereas the Eastern mind is much more intuitive. And so I believe that it's a combination of both that will really move us forward and finding that balance between rational thought and intuitive thought. But at any rate, as I was reading all of these esoteric kind of texts, I was also a big fan of hypnotic regression books, especially Brian Weiss started all of that, but Dolores Cannon was someone I really enjoyed reading because she would report on very interesting experiences people would report while they were in very deep hypnosis. So all of this different material made me realize that just reading about it was not going to give me my answers. I wasn't going to learn the purpose of life by reading other people's thoughts. It was by experiencing it. And so that's when I set on a path to really start to develop and cultivate firsthand experience. But it was really those esoteric writings that taught me how important that was. Alchemy was one of my favorite subjects. I read a lot of, still do read about different alchemical processes. And I came to realize that these alchemical sort of hermetic principles that have been around since ancient Egypt are actually still very relevant today. And they can be applied in all kinds of ways. And this is where I find myself now, is really trying to marry that ancient knowledge with what we know about science, that open-minded science that Eben has really tapped into.
With the Egyptians, I know growing up, they were simply the bad guys in the Bible.
They were the bad guys.
That was my sole knowledge of them. And reading more history in recent years, come to find out that the enslavement in Egypt might not have even happened. It might not be a historical account.
Yes, that's very interesting. And one of the first things I did as a child when I was looking for answers was I read the Bible. I wanted to read what they said. And that was one of the things. But it's so interesting that alchemy comes from Egypt. Alchemy actually means from Egypt. It was the Arabs who came up with that name. And Chem, K-H-E-M, means like black sand. And that's how they refer to Egypt. So alchemy came out of Egypt. And Egypt was known as the land of magic. They knew things that others didn't know. And I think that's what made Egypt a threat and seemingly evil, because they were able to perform feats that others couldn't do. And so I find it very interesting that there are also reports that Jesus himself, who could perform miracles and such, spent a good amount of time in Egypt. So we can only wonder if that's where he learned all of that. But to me, that's a very clear pathway to our past that could really bring some fruitful knowledge if we took our biases out, that they were evil, that they married each other's brothers and sisters got married, how wrong that is. There was a lot more going on there that we just don't understand from this perspective.
And that could be purely symbolical with the New Testament writers having Jesus spend time in Egypt, but it is interesting how they made that connection between Jesus and Egypt.
Yeah, and in Egypt itself, there is evidence that he was there. They have special locations where he supposedly visited, and over the 2,000 years, people remember, and that oral kind of history has come down that he did spend time in Egypt. But traditional scholars sometimes scoff at these sorts of things, and that's where I've learned to really not necessarily trust academic sources 100%, because even Eben was very stuck in his modeling of how the world worked. And once he was able to kind of move out of that academic setting, he was able to, expand his knowledge out of that traditional sense. So I think we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? All of that science is so critically important in many ways, and yet it doesn't have to rule our lives. It's not the only way to explain our reality, but both really, the spiritual, esoteric, kind of experiential, intuitive knowings, and then the hard, how can we measure all of this physical reality? Both together, I think, will make a beautiful society for us. But we've had so much separation between the two. It's almost like you have to pick between one or the other. You're either a rational scientist or a crazy, intuitive, spiritual person. But I believe back in Egypt, they had that figured out. They married those two. They were just married to begin with. They were never divorced. And so alchemy, for example, is one of those traditions that brings both science and inner experience together. So while alchemy also has a bad reputation in some people's minds, I believe it holds some answers that would be worth looking at again. And I do it not in the sense of changing lead into gold, which is what it's known for, but more the internal transformational processes that we can all go to. We can turn our spirit from lead into gold just by focusing on our inner worlds, taking time to go within, and that's where the Sacred Acoustics recordings come in handy.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about your Sacred Acoustics tracks, which I've been using. You reminded me of the Tao Te Ching, for instance, says that the Tao that can be spoken or written is not the eternal Tao. There's this distinction between reading, writing, things we intellectually know, and what we actually experience as reality. I know, being a more intellectually directed person myself, I could read about these ancient spiritual books and practices all day long. It's much more difficult to get into actually experiencing them. And I know in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, it says that you also had a difficult time with meditation when you were starting out.
I did. It was incredibly challenging. And you hear about these Tibetan monks who, before they become expert meditators, have to spend 10,000 hours in practice. And to the Western mind, who works 40 hours a week, has a family to take care of, a child to raise, all of the things that distract us, that's incredibly intimidating. But that's where the balance comes in. We can be of the world, in the world, but also have this other awareness of the greater reality that exists. And yes, it is direct experience that gets you there. And it's, the Eastern guru types will ask you some mysterious question that doesn't have an answer and send you off to contemplate that. But the Western mind gets kind of annoyed with that. And so having more answers is helpful. And that's where I learned to ask questions within, come up with a sort of a system to marry both kinds of approaches. And that can be very useful. But yes, when I first started with all of this, very hard to quiet the mind. And it was certain types of sound that helped me do that. And at first it was things like gongs, crystal bowls, brass bowls, tuning forks, and anything you might know. The sounds of those kinds of instruments have this kind of regular wah, wah, wah sound, very entraining. And that's what binaural beats are. They're a combination of frequencies that produces that same type of sound that really helps to quiet the mind. And I know the particular kind of technology has been listened to by Tibetan monks, and they will say, oh my gosh, some of them will say, I got to the places within a few days of practicing with these recordings than I did on my own over many, many years. So to me, they're not a replacement for that type of meditation by any means, but they certainly can be very effective training wheels to kind of help us learn to recognize these different states of awareness. Because I know when I first started to explore, how can I have one of these experiences, sort of an expanded state? I wanted some big obvious thing to happen, like a big light to show up, or an Indian chief spirit guide, or, something really splashy. And what I learned over time is that that's not how it works. Recognizing these expanded states of awareness is much more subtle. But between the practice and actually between the practice listening to the recordings and then doing it without the recordings, you can find that you can tune into that same sort of energy. But yes, Eben actually listens to Sacred Acoustics a couple hours a day. In fact, I think he's doing it right now. And he uses them to return to that state that he felt during his near-death experience. But he's the first, and I'll be the second to tell you, you don't need to have that near-death experience to have that kind of connection to something greater. It really is a birthright for all of us to understand it firsthand. It's just our society has stripped it out of it even being important. Scientists for a long time have said our emotions, or if we feel like we dreamed about someone who passed away. I know I dreamed about my stepfather after he had committed suicide, and in the dream, so much was resolved. And many people would say, oh, that's just wishful thinking. And scientists would say, oh, that's just a hallucination. But when my stepfather gave me information that I then passed on to my mother that turned out to be factual, that he could not have known, or I could not have known, I had my own firsthand experience of, yes, this is real. So we don't need to wait around for scientists to tell us. We can all find out for ourselves by doing these kinds of practices. Many ways to do it, not just the sound.
Yeah. What does the term binaural beats even mean? What is the binaural?
Well, bi means two, and aural means through the ear. So what that means is you're getting two frequencies, one frequency in the left ear, a second frequency in the other ear, and the difference between them is correlated to a specific brainwave state. So I'll give you an example to make that clear. 4 hertz is roughly, when you do an EEG, the electric signal that's measured out of your brain, 4 hertz is usually measured right between awake and asleep, right as you're falling asleep or right as you're waking up. Because 0 to 4 hertz, the delta range, you're asleep. 4 to 7 hertz, the theta range, is that meditative state. So if we can create binaural beats with a difference of 4 hertz between them, say 100 hertz in this ear, 104 hertz in the other ear, then you're being delivered a 4 hertz signal to the brain. Now, Eben would tell you that it's being interpreted by a very primitive part of the brain in the lower brain stem, where he believes that's where consciousness is very related to within the brain, that fundamental primal consciousness. And so that's what we believe we're tapping into. And what it does is, when you hear these sounds, they always sound something like wah, wah, wah at different sort of speeds, depending on the difference between the two frequencies. That's the same kind of sound you're hearing out of gongs and tuning forks, crystal bowls, brass bowls. And when we analyze those kinds of instruments, we find that they are producing a natural binaural beat. And so binaural beat is not that mysterious. That's the scientific name for that type of sound, that regular wah, wah, rhythmic sort of sound. Now, a monaural beat, that's where you would take a drum, for example, and just hit the same frequency over and over. That can also be in training in its own way. And we actually, in the Sacred Acoustics technology, we combine monaural and binaural beats just to give it that extra power. And every frequency that we include in our recordings is harmonic to every other frequency on that track. And so we're able to create binaural beats that sound a little bit more musical than traditional binaural beats, because very often they sound not very pleasing to the ear. And so producers have learned to put white noise or pink noise or sounds like rain behind it to sort of help the ear listen. But when we apply harmonic principles, that's no longer quite as important. And really, if your listeners want to learn more, the best way is to find out for yourself and just listen. And so we do offer at the Sacred Acoustics website a free 20-minute download. Just enter your email, we'll send you a link, and you can try it out for yourself and see what happens. Everyone is unique and has different responses because our brain waves are unique from one person to the next. And brainwaves can be used, I understand, the same way as fingerprints. That's how unique they are from one to the next. So it's no wonder we have different responses, but some people might feel very relaxed. Others will feel like their thoughts fade into the background more. Others might feel little tingling or vibrations in their body. Some people might just fall asleep because it can take a little time to cultivate that ability to balance between awake and asleep. But some people listen to our recordings to fall asleep because they have insomnia.
Yeah.
So many reasons that people listen. One, for meditative support. We did a pilot study where people reduced anxiety by 26%. Some people use these on the other extreme for out-of-body experience or lucid dreaming. So there's a wide range of results or goals you can have by using these kinds of recordings. But basically, they quiet the mind so that you can set your mind onto something, some goal that you have that will better be achieved by having that quiet mind. So that's the kind of common denominator between them all.
Yeah. Do you know who was the first to come up with this idea of using technology to create these tones? I've read a little bit about Robert Monroe and the Monroe Institute. I'm not sure if he was the first to create binaural beats.
Well, interestingly, there was someone, a Prussian physicist named Wilhelm Dove, and I forget the exact year, but it was somewhere in the mid-1800s, where he, through using tuning forks, found out that when you played one tuning fork in one ear slightly different in the other, that it would cause these sort of altered states of awareness. And so there was research going on before Bob Monroe really started doing this in earnest. He was a radio engineer who started having these, I'll say, spontaneous out-of-body experiences, but he was at the same time listening to these subliminal audio recordings that he had been creating for learning while you sleep. And so he thought that the audio recordings might have something to do with inducing those out-of-body experiences. So he set off to do a lot of research to figure out how to do this so that people could do it a little more consciously than just, kind of out of nowhere. And so it was in 71, I believe, 1971. I may be incorrect about the year, but a Scientific American article was written about binaural beats where they kind of compiled all the disparate research that had been going on here and there. And they found some patterns that it would help with sleep, with focus, with some mental health issues. And that Scientific American article is what Bob Monroe and his team were inspired by to start creating a specific type of sound with binaural beats. And so it really is Bob Monroe who brought binaural beats into the modern age. And the Hemisync technology that was created by Bob Monroe was actually my favorite type of binaural beat. It really had the best effect on me, having tried many others. That was what really inspired myself and my audio engineer who co-founded Sacred Acoustics to create recordings that kind of went beyond where Hemisync was. So maybe the recordings might spend only 20 minutes in a certain state, and we wanted to spend 40 minutes in a certain state. And so it was our collaboration where we started making our own recordings, and really through that process learned for ourselves how binaural beats are created. And I will credit my audio engineer for being the real genius behind it all, but he basically took binaural beats apart, put them back together again in what we thought was an improved fashion. But in reality, it was improved to our taste. And so that was how, our judgment of it being better may not be the same for all listeners. And really all binaural beats are just slightly different in the way that they're produced. And it might take some trial and error for us to find the particular ones that work best. And some will say Sacred Acoustics works best for them. Others will say different binaural beats work best for them. And that just is an attestament to our differences. And that's completely fine. But yeah, that's how it all came together.
Great. Yeah, I started listening to soundtracks like that for meditation back around 2008. And I was under a lot of stress, and it would help me fall asleep. I would every night put this on, and it was a binaural beat track that had rain, just a steady rain as the backdrop. What distinguishes your sacred acoustic tracks is there's a progression of sounds, different movements, almost symphonic in a way.
Yeah, we call them sound journeys for that reason, because we very meticulously create a sound at the beginning that will hopefully very quickly put you into that relaxed state, and sometimes a little too relaxed. So occasionally we'll add in a little theta, a little alpha to kind of keep you relaxed in that delta range, but also kind of awaken your awareness so that you don't just fall asleep. But yeah, we create unique soundscapes for every single recording that we do, which is not necessarily the case for other binaural beat producers. Some just find, oh, this one works well, let's just make different guidance, and different purposes for them. But ours are really created from scratch. And so that's why they all sound very different from each other. And each one is sort of a combination of the different brainwave states, like I say, sort of coming and going throughout. We did create, just from popular demand, some recordings that are just musical throughout with no shift at all. And so you can listen to, say, 6 hertz for as long as you wish. That's in the theta range, without all of that variation. And so we do have some recordings like that, but most of them are, as you say, those very defined journeys to kind of go in, get very, very deep, and then bring you back out to conscious awareness. That's exactly how they work. I kind of liken it to lucid dreaming, where lucid dreaming is when you're asleep, you're dreaming, and within that dream, you have the awareness that you're dreaming. So that just means you kind of awaken within the dream. Whereas these types of recordings from an awake state help you enter into a relaxed state where you can potentially have that kind of lucid dream, but have a little more ability to manage it with your mind. So that's another way to look at it.
Yeah, that's great. Sometimes it does knock me out, just put me to sleep. And I wonder if that's because I only have several weeks experience. Is it something where the more you listen, the greater your ability to stay awake during the entire track?
Absolutely. When I first started listening, I would just fall asleep as well. And it was very frustrating, because when you do this, say, in a workshop setting, and you come back together to talk about your experience, for example, other people would talk about, oh, I went through this door. They said to go through this door, and then there was this cloud, and they said, get a message. And I missed all of that. I wouldn't have heard any of that. And I would think, oh my gosh, I just missed the whole thing. But I learned over time, you're absolutely correct. You kind of adjust, your body learns to sort of maintain that awareness without just falling asleep. But keep in mind, so many people in our world have trouble with insomnia that it could just really be a blessing for them. And they may not want to find that space where they're relaxed but alert. They just want to be relaxed. So but over time, you'll find that you can get a little better ability to maintain your awareness.
I did have one experience with your heart center track where I had kind of an out of body or psychedelic experience where I felt my consciousness wake up in a sort of a new space outside my body, and had some visions of mountains and such. And that was amazing. I haven't been able to get back to that space, but I feel like that was a promise of what's possible on it.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes those meaningful, splashy experiences can happen when we're not trying. And then we wonder, how can I make this happen again? And it's almost like just that act of trying or having an expectation of what should happen kind of messes up the ability to generate it. But also with practice, that ability to kind of set an intention, but then have no expectation of how it might be fulfilled, that becomes a little easier as well. And just so people realize, it's not just about passive listening, which in my mind means put the headphones on and see what happens. And that's good to do when you're first starting out and wondering, how am I going to respond to these? I know I was very curious to see what might happen the first time I listened. But over time, you realize that it doesn't necessarily take a specific recording to get you to those states. It's how you hold your energy. And so with Heart Center, you were saying that one absolutely guides you to expand out from your body, really to encompass the entire earth. And so that kind of mental exercise of removing yourself from your body can sometimes engender the type of experience you're talking about. And it's so wonderful when those things happen. But I want people to realize that even subtle changes can be incredibly valuable. And sometimes, I know when I've spent time with new practices, trying new things, that I don't necessarily notice anything different, but people around me do, right? They feel my energy is a little different, even if I don't notice. And so sometimes when people listen, they will start to feel shifts in their bodies and their minds without even realizing. And that's a beautiful thing to happen. But on the other hand, you can also have a personal goal, set your intention, and really put your mind towards making that happen. So big, wide range of ways to approach it.
Are these tracks the main meditation method you use today, or do you still use a variety of methods?
I use a variety of methods. And I will say that as the number one tester of these recordings, I had to train myself to stay so alert while listening so I could hear any clicks or anomalies that it became kind of challenging to let the tone sort of take me away. But I spent about, how many years? About 7 or 8 years listening very regularly, and found them to be incredibly helpful for so many things. But I learned over time, again, like I can now get into those states without listening to the recordings. I can shift my awareness in such a way that that training really is already there. And I think that's what happens with, the 10,000 hours of meditating as well, that you just kind of naturally fall into these states. So my practice nowadays, it doesn't usually involve sound, but it has for many years and got me to where I'm able to do that now.
That's great. Well, I hope I get there where I'm able to enter these states of relaxation without needing any external stimulus. It's certainly a great goal.
Well, I'll tell you, for you and your listeners, just in anecdotal stories that I hear from others and my own experience, it takes about 18 months to 2 years of not daily, every day, like a grind, but a combination of practices over many, many months. 18 to 24 months seems to be when suddenly people will notice, oh my gosh, I just had an out-of-body experience, or oh my gosh, my dead mother that I've always spoken to is now speaking back, right? So keep in mind, it can take time, but the results are cumulative. And the Western mind, and I was no exception, we can be very frustrated when, it doesn't happen in a week or a day or a month, and we can give up very easily. And I gave up sometimes, and then I would try something else, but I didn't stop in general. I was always seeking more methods to kind of reach these states. And I found that the more I focused on my inner world, the more I realized I had emotional traumas I didn't realize I had, that I was able to release. I learned I had limiting beliefs that were kind of holding me back that I didn't realize I had. And the more I started clearing all of that and becoming more aligned, say, with that greater part of myself, that's when the external world started to change all around me. So while I was in a frustrating relationship, a frustrating job, I lived in a frustrating location, I tried to change all of those things, and it was very, very challenging. But then when I started to focus on my inner world and my own being, all three of those things and many other things just shifted without me really having to do a lot of hard decisions and actions. It just happened before me, and I just had to follow the breadcrumbs. And I've heard other people say the same thing, that after a steady practice, again, not just weeks or months, but potentially a year or more, 18 to 24 months being a rough time that people have reported, that's when you can really maybe start to see less subtle things and more obvious things start to happen. But while those subtle things are happening, the things that aren't quite so splashy, very important to acknowledge them as real experience. And so many of us kind of dismiss the smaller things that might happen, maybe a synchronicity or something that takes place in our minds, like your experience. I forgot where I was going with that.
That we often discount those as unreal or just a dream.
Yes, yeah, just a dream, or oh, that was a coincidence or something. If you can start to celebrate those small successes and say, yes, I'm capable of doing this. Wow, that was really great. Your energy shifts and attracts more of those types of experiences. So each and every one of us can do this experiment in our own lives. Start to develop a practice, or if you already have one, continue it and add new techniques, and then just see how the world around you starts to shift. It's pretty amazing.
What are the benefits personally? I know we've talked about de-stressing, having an easier time sleeping, and what are the benefits of an expanded consciousness?
The benefits for me have been, first of all, releasing all of those, that I already mentioned, limiting beliefs and emotions. Those kinds of things can really hold you back. And so that was a huge benefit, but it was unexpected. That's not what I expected to happen, but it turned out to be quite a benefit. Now, again, we had the pilot study to reduce anxiety. You mentioned sleep, de-stress, but beyond that, Eben and I both are very strong believers that we are much, much more than our physical bodies. And Eben believes that the science is there to support that. But most of us, especially again in the Western world, are walking around not realizing that that's actually a fact. It's not just a wishful thinking belief, but it's being shown to be the truth. And so if we can open up to the idea that we're more than our physical bodies, it allows you to gain a larger perspective of maybe why you're here, what your purpose is, why certain things happen. It brings much more meaning and purpose to why we're here. I call it an alignment when you become aware of that observer within, that part of you that isn't just here thinking and moving around and planning, but that other part of you. When you can align more with that, I seemed to just become more of who I really am meant to be. Instead of wondering, am I doing it right? What is my purpose? I now understand my purpose is to be the unique energy that I am and to really bring that energy into this world. Because the other aspect of this is not only that we are more than our physical bodies, but that consciousness that is beyond our physical body is actually connected to everyone else's consciousness. And we're all working together, not really working, growing, evolving together through this experience of being human. And so this is just another shift in worldview that our world might really benefit from. We have such a mental health crisis going on. We don't need to mention all the crazy things going on in the world. Everyone knows what they are, but especially that mental health crisis, more and more people committing suicide. Why is that? And Eben and I believe that our materialist society has sort of stripped the spirit out of our very existence by insisting that it's not real and leaving it to religious scholars to tell us all about that, and really bringing these back together by feeling that connection. So listening to these recordings allows you to move beyond that idea that you're only a physical body. And this provides you with just another way of looking at the world that brings much more meaning and purpose. And I believe if more and more of us do this, we will have much fewer mental health problems because people will feel that connection to something greater. They'll feel the support of their community. They'll understand their importance, their integral part of the whole that we're all a part of. So that's the benefit, the much larger benefit that can result from this sort of thing.
That's great. That definitely provides a lot of motivation. I liked what you said about learning to just be yourself. A lot of times when we think, what is my purpose? We think it must be accomplishing this or that. when in deep states of meditation, I've gotten the message, no, it's just about being yourself and living.
Yeah, and it's almost like it's too simple, right?
Mm.
For analytical reason people, it's like, no, it can't just be that. And I love when near-death experiencers come back, and Eben was one of them, who talk about how love is the most important thing. People who have psychedelic trips come back, love is the most important thing. And we're all kind of bored with that, right? It's like, wait, can you tell us something different? I'm like, have we really learned this love thing yet? Maybe that's why we keep getting this message, because our world does not appear to be one that love is a primary principle. It may be in our individual lives, but it's not on a societal level. And that's where I think we can really start to see some shifts in our world when this kind of idea gets accepted in our secular culture.
Yeah, I think hearing that phrase, love is the most important thing, it can become hollow. When we have a real experience of that and what it means, it's something completely different than just words.
Yes, and I would love to just explain how I actually cultivated the ability to feel that love. And it was through attention to the heart. And I had read all about heart math, all the research that they had done about the heart, how the heart emits an electromagnetic field. It expands and contracts around the body in the shape of a torus, so like a donut with your heart in the middle. And it just is moving all the time based on your emotional state. The size of that electromagnetic field is based on your emotional state. So happier, loving types of emotions create a very expanded, large electromagnetic field. And they say that your electromagnetic field influences people around you without you even realizing. And so I was really concerned that my angst or anxiety inside might be influencing people around me, like my daughter and my family and such. And so I wanted to make sure what was inside my heart was going to help people only in positive ways. And that's when I started to find all of the emotional traumas and things like that. But once I got through all of that, or actually in tandem with that, heart math recommends that in order to get your heart coherent, they say, is to just develop feelings of gratitude in the heart. And I found it very easy to think of things I was grateful for, make lots of lists of things, but I wasn't necessarily feeling the gratitude at will. And so the advice there is to go back in time, remember times when you had those feelings and sort of recreate them in your mind. And for me, that was my relationship with dogs and puppies throughout my life. And so when I could think of those puppies, it generated a feeling. And as I learned to do this more, I realized that love actually comes from within. It doesn't come from without. And it's one of those concepts, we hear it all the time. Like you just said, until we experience it, we don't really understand. And so once I was able to, at will, generate these feelings of love from inside, I realized that I'm made of love. And in fact, we're all made of love. And so to love myself was really to become the love that exists inside of me. Hard to find and locate sometimes, but we all have that ability somewhere in there because that's where we came from. The near-death experiences from around the world teach us that the binding force of love is what connects us all. And so often we don't really take that to heart until we're in some type of hardship, say we're losing a loved one or we're on our deathbed ourselves. And that's when we remember, oh, love, that's the most important thing. But if we could remember it every single day as we go through our lives, that's when I think the world will have learned its lesson.
It's a good thing to visualize and meditate upon while listening to these tracks.
Well, and Heart Center, the one that you mentioned, actually is one of the ones that does exactly that, because you're imagining that your breath is moving in and out of your heart into a bubble around your body, which is that electromagnetic field. And so with your emotions, you can consciously expand your heart field. So yes, that Heart Center recording includes that exact concept for that reason.
Great. I've been listening mostly to the unguided version. You've inspired me I need to download the guided version onto my iPod and try that.
Well, let me tell you, many people don't like the guided versions. Many people don't like the unguided versions. So that's why we provide both. And I will say for me, and I do advise this to people, if you don't like recordings with words, I do recommend that you listen at least once to the one with words, if only so that you understand the intention that we had to create these sounds. And usually it is related to the words that are being stated. But on the other hand, words can get in your way. And so sometimes after a while, you do want to just stick to the nonverbal version. So there's a purpose for both.
That is important to know. You give a fantastic quote from Nikola Tesla, the great scientist. He said, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration.
Yep.
I find it fascinating how sound can have these profound effects on our mind, but indeed everything is made of energy, frequency, and vibration.
Yeah, and we started to learn that when the electron was discovered, and it went on from there. It was a huge discovery that everything vibrates. It's not just a bunch of solid particles joining up together. And so even when Eben went on his journey, his coma journey, his near-death experience, it was sound that sort of was the engine that drove him through those different stages. And when you make a sound with your voice, there's vibrations coming out. So another recommendation we have is to actually vocalize that word om, or just hum something, some vowel sound. And when you do that, and experiment with different pitches, different, high and low. And what you find when you make those sounds is that you're creating vibrations in your physical body. And once you can feel those, then you kind of notice more of your energy. And while you're listening to the sound, you can imagine your vibrations sort of latching onto the audio recordings vibrations for your journey. So it's just another way to acknowledge that vibration that we all are a part of. It's harder to think of a table being made up of only vibration, but our bodies, we can actually feel it. So it's a good practice.
Yeah. And that ties us back in with the ancient Egyptians and Pythagoras, so the Hermetic philosophy. All these figures, they understood somehow intuitively that everything is energy and frequency.
I often wonder if they understood intuitively or if we've lost a science that used to exist. Because if Egypt knew how to perform miracles and turn lead into gold and many, many other things, that lore, let's consider from this perspective, they really did know how to do that. And they had the ability to build that pyramid. Very interestingly, a lot of the theories that sort of ring true to me are that the Great Pyramid was built using sound, that a particular sound would change the atomic makeup of the stone such that it could be moved, or it could be sort of softened into the shape that they wanted. They didn't need the kind of tools we have now because they were able to manipulate matter by tapping into that vibration and using the power of their mind to make it happen. And many, many people will share that we're only limited by our beliefs. If we don't believe we can do something, well, we can't. I think Henry Ford had a quote, something like that, although it escapes me. But those people knew how to do it. Just because we don't know how to do it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so I think that we have lost a science. And so Pythagoras spent time in Egypt as well. And I believe he is our link, actually, from the Greek tradition that was really the foundation of the Western world. I think Pythagoras is our link to that hidden past knowledge. He brought us geometry, music, sound healing, so many things that are still relevant today. Even the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy credits Pythagoras with being the father of philosophy. And he's not one of the core Greek people like Plato and Aristotle with all the writings. In fact, Pythagoras didn't write anything. We only know about him from other people's writings. And perhaps he didn't need to write anything. Some of the lore around him is that he was half a god because he had amazing abilities. So I also find it interesting that his school, the Pythagorean school, was open to men and women. He believed men and women were equal. We're not necessarily the same, but we're equal. And Egypt had that same idea that men and women were equal. And so that's another thing that we've been spending thousands of years trying to get back, this idea that men and women are equal. So I feel like we've gone into a decline. We're coming out of the decline. and that we will regain all of this knowledge we used to have. So that's the way I look at it.
It's fascinating. So many mysteries of history. And I definitely need to learn more about Pythagoras. I have not read much on him.
I recently have gotten into Pythagoras and found that I resonate with him so much. And our audio engineer was actually incredibly inspired by Pythagoras. His harmonic octaves, the way he described them, is exactly how we apply our frequencies. We use Pythagorean theories to create our tones. But even then, I wasn't as familiar with all of the other amazing things he's brought to us until more recently. But yeah, a great link to the past. Some even say, there's some Indians who say that Pythagoras spent time in India and learned some of what they learned from their, something that they had sort of documented from their ancient past through those Vedic texts. Yes, I could talk about that kind of thing for quite a while.
That's great. What do you have going on right now in terms of workshops?
Well, the best one actually for your listeners would be to go to unitedinhopeandhealing.com. And that's where Eben Alexander and I have been hosting a webinar series for the past year. Ever since the COVID pandemic started limiting travel, when we realized we couldn't do our normal travel, we started inviting colleagues and friends that we normally would have seen at conferences, and we have these great conversations with them. And so anyone who wants to see all of the past conversations, we were talking with Pim Van Lommel, Raymond Moody, Larry Dawsey, Anita Morjani, many, many, many other experiencers, researchers around all of this consciousness and, what happens when we die and all of that are available. We're continuing the series as well. And I will tell you that in May or June, we haven't picked the date yet, Gary Zukav will be one of our guests. So that's coming up.
Great. Do you have any other book ideas or books in the works?
We do. One is actually very related to marrying ancient mysticism with modern science in ways that I haven't seen done before.
Great.
And the other is really compiling all of the evidence that exists that our consciousness continues beyond death, because that evidence is there. And if people start to realize it's there, grief won't be as challenging, because you know that you will see your loved one again one day, or that you can communicate with your loved one now and that that's actually real. It's really putting together a new worldview that acknowledges the eternity of soul. So those are kind of the two projects that are on our minds right now.
That's wonderful. Well, Karen, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. I've really enjoyed it. And you've inspired me to keep going with the Sacred Acoustics tracks.
Very good. Yes, it's important, don't beat yourself up if you skip a week or two because you got distracted. Just start again. You'll pick up right where you left off. And sometimes a little break actually gives you a different sort of experience when you return. So I know some people beat themselves up when they don't keep a consistent pattern, and I will allow that is not necessarily a requirement. It helps, but sometimes those gaps can help too.
Wonderful. Thanks for all your great work.
Well, thank you for inviting me on your podcast, and thank you for spreading the word on any of these fascinating topics you cover. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Living from the Soul. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, subscribe, and review. This is an ad-free podcast brought to you by my books, which are available at samtarode.com. The theme music was created by Gideon Tarode.